The financial markets pretend that we need their money, and they pretend that the public sector is not able to do anything on its own. But I think we have to be very precise. Financial markets can only redistribute. Governments can spend their own money. They have a monopoly creating that money. So the Bank of England, on behalf of the British Treasury, can create as much money as the Treasury wants. They can finance the green transition all alone. They don't need any money from financial markets. What the financial markets make available is government money.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far, and thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pina.
And we're delighted to be joined today once again by economist and author Dr. Dirk Ehnts. Thanks for joining us today, Dirk.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Christian and Patricia.
So, as we record this, the World Economic Forum Summit in Davos, Switzerland, just wrapped up. For anyone new here, the World Economic Forum is to economics what the Eurovision Song Contest is to songs. And so we've waded through the cookie cutter pop music of the CEOs and the plastic PR posturing of the politicians so that you don't have to. It does offer a perspective on where the economic Overton window is for the masters of mankind. So, Dirk, to set the tone of the event, the World Economic Forum posted on its website an article entitled "The Public Sector Can't Finance Net Zero Alone." And it goes on to tell us that public sector financing is not sufficient to meet an estimated $4 to $6 trillion a year needed for a global net zero transformation. Dirk, what's wrong with that headline and that sentiment from a modern monetary theory perspective?
Well, this kind of framing is what we usually get when people follow Margaret Thatcher's idea of taxpayers' money. So the idea that taxpayers are giving money to the government, and there's only a certain amount of money that you can get from taxpayers. And maybe you can borrow some money, but you would have to repay that kind of money as well. So public debt would be bad because somehow future generations would have to pay it down, which of course historically has never happened. So in this kind of framing, the government is constrained. And in MMT, the government is the creator of currency. It's not a user of currency, but the creator of currency. So central banks create our money, and they have a monopoly creating that money. So the Bank of England can, on behalf of the British Treasury, can create as much money as the Treasury wants, given the political rules. If the rules are somehow against it, like in the US, for example, where they have the debt ceiling, then you can change those political rules and then you can suspend. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, just last December, just at the end of the year, the Biden administration in the US, for example, they increased government spending by, I think it was 1.4 trillion because they were afraid of hitting the debt limit. So they had some kind of amendment to the budget, which was 1.4 trillion. So if the US can just by signing some kind of amendment to the budget, create 1.4 trillion US dollars, $4 to $6 trillion is not that far away from it. So of course, all the other countries can create as much money as they want in terms of their own currency. So the central banks are always the monopoly suppliers of currency. And what really matters is whether the resources are there so that you can actually buy stuff with the money. To simplify it a bit, if you have a situation of full employment, for example, and the government wants to spend more money and buy more or pay more workers to help building infrastructure, for example, green infrastructure, then this cannot be done at existing prices. because there's no more workers to be had. They're all employed. So you would have to bid up wages. So government spending can be inflationary, but whether it is inflationary or not depends on the situation in the economy. Mostly the question of whether we have unemployment and or available workers, but also in terms of resources, whether we have enough resources to use. So it's not correct to say that governments cannot finance the green transition. They can finance the green transition all alone. They don't need any money from financial markets. And it's the other way around, actually. So financial markets cannot create money. Banks can create money and the government can create money. So the government's money is what we call reserves. It's those tax credits that the banks are holding on our behalf, more or less. And we have bank deposits, but with bank deposits, you cannot pay taxes. So bank deposits are something else entirely. But financial markets can only redistribute some of those bank deposits. They're not able to create their own money. So it's really odd from the scientific perspective that the financial market, people believe that they somehow can make available money that the government would not have, whereas it's completely the other way around. What the financial markets make available is government money. It's state money, even though it might be promises of payment in the form of bank deposits, but it's always in state currency. So that is, I think, a wrong position. And it's not so good that the whole event started with an article like this, claiming that the financial markets are needed to somehow finance the green transition.
Patricia, what do you make of this framing of the governments are helpless unless the private sector is going to jump in and save them?
Basically, I have a very cynical view on it. I think that Davos and the fact that they've started with this kind of statement, right? It's a statement of both the inability of government to do anything about our problems and at the same time is making the private sector more relevant and crucial to our future. So I have a view that Davos is a PR exercise for basically private firms who can see that there are world problems and that people are growing discontent about various issues, not the least about climate change. And they want to portray themselves as doing something about it. And not just that, but being specially positioned to do something about it and making themselves relevant and trying to provide some sort of reassurance to people that things are being taken care of. And whereas we see year after year, all these Davos speeches, all these, even sometimes you get your controversial statements of people in Davos telling the rich to get taxed and things like that. But how does that translate into actual practical change? I don't see any of change in direction as a result of whatever happens in Davos.
Just a qualification, we're not saying the state should run everything down to the last food truck and corner shop. We're saying the state can absolutely in its own currency afford to do that. And so given that, the debate should be about the appropriate balance between the public and the private sector's involvement, given the problem to be solved. And I thought it was worth noting that when something's perceived as an actual threat, like, say, having your country invaded, the president of that country comes to Davos to say, dear governments of the world, we need you. And not yesterday, not along a 10-year time horizon. We need governments to chuck money and resources at us now. This is an emergency. They don't bang on about enabling the private sector to innovate a brand new accounting trick or mint an NFT to save their country, because it's obviously a state sector emergency. And I think until the environment is seen as being an equivalent emergency with lives at stake, we're going to keep getting panels with titles like Philanthropy, a Catalyst for Protecting Our Planet and Davos, right? I'm sympathetic to the idea that, you know, only the super rich can save us. If you're in a room full of people with these life-changing levels of wealth, it's hard not to say, please spend your money on X, because I think it will save lives. But I think Vladimir Zelensky's appearances at Davos, with him publicly pressuring governments to act, should emphasize the point that, yes, the private sector can give us lovely upholstery and entertainment on the Titanic, but it's still sinking if we don't get all hands on deck to fix the hole in the boat, if you know what I mean.
I think it also goes to the fact that these attitudes of, well, the market knows best. And if we just let ourselves go and trust that the market will give us solutions, eventually it will. And we're coming to the realization that it's not going to happen. And so basically, these people are trying to say the same thing, but framing it in a slightly a different way to make people think that this represents a change from the status quo. If you look at it in detail, you understand that it doesn't.
So the financial markets, they pretend that we need their money, and they pretend that the public sector is not able to do anything on its own. But I think we have to be very precise. The public sector, so the governments, they can spend their own money. And there's no need to borrow any money, because that just means that they would have to pay interest rates to the people that they are borrowing it from. And since the government, at least the federal government, is the currency issuer anyway, they can really borrow money. It doesn't make any sense to borrow money if you can just normally spend money and create money when you do that, which is what central banks normally do, creating new money when the government spends. So, of course, the next question is then, what does the government spend it on? And that is where we obviously say, well, they spend it on stuff that they buy from the private sector, goods and services. But they could also have public companies delivering stuff like infrastructure, critical infrastructure that we need for the green transition. So just by saying that the government should pay for all these kind of things when it comes to the green transition does not mean that we want an economy where you have only state-planned firms delivering all the stuff that is purchased by the government. So it will always be a mixed economy. And the private sector, the real sector, is good, delivering some of the things that we need. And that's where the division comes in between the public sector and the private sector. So the financing question is different from the question who is delivering the goods in the end.
So kind of related to what money is and where it comes from, Dirk, as you touched on a few beats ago, the perennial debt ceiling drama is, as we record this, playing out in the US once again. Now, through the MMT lens, Dirk, what materially is the US national debt, just to be precise?
Well, since we describe money as tax credits, I would say that the public debt is nothing else but the dollars that were spent by the US governments, federal government and also local governments, minus all those dollars that were created and have been taxed back. So all the outstanding dollars that are still in circulation in the economy that were once being spent into the economy by the government and not yet being taxed, that is what we call the public debt. Warren Mosler used to say that this is the government's money supply in a way, but it is not debt as, for example, a private debt. So when I borrow money from a bank, for instance, then I would have to repay that kind of money at some date. But this is not the case when the US government spends. So the only thing that they promise when they spend dollars into the economy is that they take it back for payments to the state, like in tax revenues in the future. So we should not call it public debt, to be honest, because it's nothing that will be repaid down to zero as happens with private debt.
And just while we're on this topic, as a follow-up, Dirk, we have a listener, Andrew Cramp, hi Andrew, who wrote to us to ask, if public debt is non-government sector savings, as you've just described, Dirk, can we view private debt as government sector savings?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that the main thing here to realize is that the government is the creator of money. And if money is nothing else but a tax credit, then the government cannot really save. So the government can have a surplus. So if tax revenues are above government spending, then you get a reduction in government debt, public debt. Well, that's the name that we're still using. But this is something different because this is just reducing the debt of the government. But it's not normal, at least, that the government has a negative public debt. So it's running up surpluses until somehow people are in debt as a private sector debt is so large that, again, that the government is reducing public debt to zero and then beyond. In the 1990s, the US was in a situation where this was not unlikely to happen under Bill Clinton because of all those surpluses of the private sector. But if the government has a public surplus, that means that the private sector normally has a deficit. And the private sector cannot have a deficit for many years in a row because it reduces purchasing power. So you will have a recession or even a depression at some point because these public surpluses are destroying too much purchasing power in the economy for the economy to continue to work. And that is also what happened with the recession in 2000, 2001. So it's not possible for the government to run up a consistent surplus.
Is it fair to say when the government spends and then after it spends, it issues debt, what gets called debt in our country, they're called gilts in the UK. And it's a choice. We've said many times, that's a choice to do that. It's a tool to manage monetary policy in materially, monetary operations wise. That's what it is, rather than fiscal policy. So anyway, when the government spends money into existence, it issues debt. And that debt is the government owing itself something that it issues. So, like you've said before, Dirk, cinema tickets in the hands of the cinema owner are just paper. Once they're issued into the hands of a cinema customer, now it's become something. It's become a promise that the cinema owner has to fulfill. So I think that's a good way of thinking about what government debt is. Whereas when the private sector creates credit by taking out a loan, the person that takes out the loan issues a promise to pay to the bank, and the bank issues credit to the recipient of the credit, the person who takes out the loan. And those two things, those two monetary instruments, if you like, net out to zero. So this is the difference between creating net financial assets, which is what the government does when it creates credit, when it spends money into existence and for the private sector. Whereas when the private sector goes into debt, it's going into debt to itself. And therefore, that's a kind of long-winded explanation of what we mean by net financial assets.
You are right that the government is creating those tax credits. And what the banks are doing when they are lending is they create those promises to pay. And of course, the promises to pay that are credited to the accounts of the borrowers, they equal the amount of money that will have to be repaid plus interest. So you could even say that banks, when they are lending, they are net destroyers of money. I mean, the interest is redistributed. So to some extent, you could say it's still happening, that it's neutral in a way when it comes to the quantity of money in the economy created. But yeah, I mean, these two are different things. And I think the main difference is that the government is the issue of currency and as such cannot have large savings.
So just to summarize from what is just being discussed, the Andrews statement makes a lot more sense if he was going to replace savings with surplus. But savings is something that non-currency issuers do.
Yeah.
You've just said in one sentence what I've just waffled about for 10 minutes. So given you're on a roll, Patricia, the idea of governments going into debt is different for a lot of developing economies, but more specifically, economies that borrow in a foreign currency. Could you say something about that?
If we apply that same logic, then developing economies, or just generally economies that borrow in a foreign currency, they don't issue that currency, right? If a Latin American economy borrows dollars, then they don't themselves issue dollars. So it is possible for them to save dollars, I guess, and that's called foreign currency reserves. And they can run out of those things, and it can also be useful in other occasions to have those things because they need dollars for their economies to function. So they are non-currency issuers and they can save.
There was a panel at Davos, turning back to Davos, entitled "Is a New Debt Crisis Looming?" And sometimes on these panels, they fudge the difference between debt denominated in a country's own currency, and they conflate private debt with public debt and everything. So I just wanted to make sure that we had covered that topic. So turning back to Davos 2023, something that's caused a split among attendees was the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, which subsidizes companies that invest in green technology. Now, to an outsider like me, evidently governments aren't moving fast enough on a just transition. But to many at Davos, the Inflation Reduction Act is, according to our business secretary, Grant Shapps, dangerous. It's going to spark a trade war between the EU and the US. You've got the ECB's Christine Lagarde warning against a race to the bottom. The Czech Republic's trade minister equated it to doping in sport. But then at the other end of elite opinion, you've got the International Energy Agency's representative calling it the most important climate action since the Paris 2015 agreement. There were also activists at fringe events uplifting the scientific consensus that we're not moving fast enough to save literally the only planet we've got capable of sustaining human life. So lip service was paid to the idea of hearing voices of what the World Economic Forum would call stakeholders. To the rest of us, that's just people. But Dirk, what do you make of this framing that when a government takes mild, inadequate steps to address the climate emergency, that it's somehow declaring a trade war?
That's a very strange way to put it. To give you some perspective, governments do a lot of stuff. I mean, they spend a lot of money and they pay for the National Health Service, for example. And the National Health Service, of course, is an indirect subsidy to all UK companies because it means that the workers will be more healthy and will be working more days than they would otherwise if the NHS would not exist. So it's the same with education. So in Germany, for example, we have free education at public universities, and I would say that they are quite good, even though in international rankings, they normally don't score well. And of course, these universities are subsidies to the German industrial sector. They can get engineers for free. They're not coming to work at a company saying, okay, here I am, thanks for hiring me, and I have 200,000 euros of student loans that I need to pay off. So please pay me a lot of money because I need to pay off the student debt before I can pay for anything else. So they just come to the company and say, whatever you want to pay me, it's going to be okay. So they make a decent salary. This is, of course, something where you could say, well, this is an illegal subsidy, but somehow we don't. So these kind of public services are taken out of the equation when it comes to public subsidies. It's different when, for example, China, the Chinese government was heavily subsidizing the solar energy industry, especially solar panels. And at some point, the prices were so low that the Germans weren't able to compete. And then, of course, you have a trade war if you want. So this is something where goods and services are concerned that are internationally traded. Normally, we don't trade public services like education or healthcare. This is why there's a difference. But of course, the idea is a little bit strange that you would say that if you subsidize, for example, sustainable energy, then this would be an unfair subsidy for industry. So, of course, all the countries are sovereign, or should be at least. And if they want to subsidize something in order to be more autonomous when it comes to energy, for example, and also to do something for the environment, to have sustainable energy, then, of course, we should rank these concerns higher than the question whether this kind of policy will reduce costs for companies, and the companies will then have lower prices and will be able to be more competitive in international markets. So that's really a strange way of framing it. We have seen the opposite happening in Germany, where we did not invest enough in sustainable energy. And now that gas prices have gone up and energy prices have gone up so much in at least last year, then of course the German goods and services produced here in Germany were much more expensive than those produced in the US or China, for example, where energy prices did not go up by that much. So yeah, I don't believe that this kind of framing of the energy transition as something which is causing a trade war is making a lot of sense here. So I completely agree with you there.
I just wanted to add this comment from the Czech Republic's trade minister after he talked about subsidies being like doping in sport. He added, quote, "If you then have to live without subsidies, it is difficult to turn back to a normal life," end quote. And I'm like, well, obviously don't live without subsidies. It seems pretty obvious to me.
I think the Czech experience probably is connected to the communist times, where all kinds of things were subsidized, also in Eastern Germany during communist times, where I had an uncle in around Schwerin who was growing roses that he sold for 5 Ostmark to the shop. And in the shop, you could buy them at 4. And it was obvious that there was an arbitrage opportunity. So you could just sell stuff to the shop and then come back and buy it, your own produce, and then sell it once more to the government, to the state. That is an indirect subsidy.
On Wall Street, they would call that short selling.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're arbitraging there. I think it's difficult to understand for many people that the way that we have to transform our economies means that we have to not rely on market mechanisms. Because using market mechanisms, there's nothing cheaper than gas cars and diesel-powered cars. So, of course, we need to change something. If you just let the market work, we'll get what we have today. And because we don't like what we have today, so that means we need to change something, and we need to change those prices. And, of course, we can make gasoline more expensive and tax it, but that's not what voters want. So the second best option is to subsidize energy creation. And that's what we're doing. But again, that's what the Davos people probably don't like, because they all made their money on markets. And yeah, that's for them. It's an odd thought that the government, for example, should pick winners and pick industries to subsidize. That seems to them a little bit unfair if the government is subsidizing some sectors like sustainable energy creation and not subsidizing others. I think that is where this is coming from Davos.
Is there an element of this which is really about what can money actually measure and what it can't measure? Because when we talk about market mechanism, we talk about supply and demand and costs of doing something, but environmental costs are not included in those market mechanisms. So it ignores a whole range of real costs that are completely ignored. And the only way to force the market, say, into taking into account these costs is through regulation.
I just wanted to throw this line in because I think it rhymes with what the Czech Republic's trade minister was saying about subsidies being like doping. There was a panel about fiscal policy. I think it was called something like, "Are we seeing the return of fiscal policy?" or something like that. And the Commissioner for the Economy for the EC, the European Commission, Paolo Gentiloni, said the longer the special measures go on, the more painful it will be when we exit them. It's a similar kind of sentiment, right? So again, my answer is, well, don't exit them. Dirk, as a European, what do you think about that?
There's a consensus in the mainstream that we want to go back to normal. Okay, we want to go back to having fiscal policy on the one hand, and we want to have monetary policy on the other hand. And there's a dividing line, and the word is very simple, so that the central bank takes care of inflation, and the fiscal policies and just make sure that the governments don't grow too big. But the idea is that once you have stable and low rates of inflation, you will get full employment automatically. And none of that has worked. So it's hard, of course, for those mainstream economists to admit that the economic policy instruments don't work as they promised they would work. And now, for example, in the Eurozone, we have the Stability and Growth Pact is off. So there's an escape clause that had been activated in 2020. And that means that it doesn't matter what your fiscal deficit is, you will not be punished as a Eurozone country. So you can now ramp up government spending to address the problems in your society, ignoring those fiscal deficits. And now we have a record low unemployment rate in the Eurozone, which is a very good result. So that, of course, is very odd for those mainstream policy makers and also mainstream economists, that you turn off the rules, which were supposed to be good, and then you get results in terms of economic policy, which are much better than those results which we got with the rules turned on. And yeah, I completely agree that the longer we have the Stability and Growth Pact turned off, and the longer we have the ECB using those asset purchase programs to make sure that national governments can spend, the more we will realize that it's much better without those rules, these fiscal waterboarding rules, I call them. And it's much better with the ECB being a dealer of last resort for government bonds so that the speculators don't win, which is what all the other central banks are doing too.
I've noticed that journalists have a hard time trapping economists into making predictions, I've noticed on these Davos panels. But is your sense that they will turn the rules back on again?
No, I don't think so. I mean, as long as the Ukraine war is going on, there's a lot of fallout still also from the pandemic and the spike in energy prices. I don't think they will turn them on. We have these debates about the fiscal framework, which will be reformed. So I think there will be a tit for tat kind of thing, that if the rules are to be turned on, then we need to have a reform of the fiscal framework before, so that the rules are turned back on, but they are now then diluted, so that countries have much more leeway when it comes to government spending, and they're not forced, as they would be now, to reduce public debt so quickly, which is impossible, I guess, economically, without causing a recession. So the good thing is that on the European level, people have realized that the fiscal framework doesn't work. There were no calls for austerity since the start of the pandemic, so nobody wants to have these kind of ideas back. And now we are having at least halfway decent debate in Europe about a reform of the fiscal rules. So I think that generally things are moving into the right kind of direction, even though that change is still disappointingly slow, but at least there's change in the right kind of direction.
Okay, so turning the corner, there were two big themes at Davos this year. One was energy and the other was jobs. And economists were divided over whether the number of jobs will grow or shrink in our new high interest rate environment. Now, my reading of what Warren Mosley has been saying and what he said to us the last time we talked was that the rate hikes have increased interest income payments from the government to the private sector. So the hikes can be thought of as fiscal stimulus rather than monetary policy. It's not the kind of government intervention we'd prefer to see because it's regressive. But to me, Warren's view perhaps explains why mainstream economists seem to be predicting a milder recession in places like the UK and the US than they were 6 months ago. But to mainstream economists, this all means that monetary policy is working rather than Warren's view of interest rates is correct. So, Patricia, what's your view? And have I got the MMT take correct?
I think so, because MMT basically says that monetary policy is unpredictable at best and counterproductive at worst. And Warren's views on it is a big part of that, but also the fact that interest rates are in themselves an input in the production of goods, right? Many firms will fund capital investment with borrowing, or even if they don't, they still assess the viability of capital investment based on how much they can get on the base interest rates, right? So it does have an impact on the production process. That is a tendency towards increasing production cost, and one can assume then that results in price increases. And it also has an impact on the amount of money that people are getting through the interest rate channel, as Warren calls it. There are other factors as well that may affect demand. As people are spending more on interest rates, and they're spending less on actual goods and services as well. So that sort of works against it. So as far as I know, nobody's done a study of how these factors counter each other out. First and foremost, because items like what Warren highlights have not been widely accepted yet, and they're not even considered in those calculations. But also because many of these effects that the channels of monetary policy transmission, as they call it, haven't really been understood as to their relative magnitude. So we don't really have an idea of what is dominant effect, right? And this, of course, makes monetary policy incredibly unreliable. These factors also bear in mind that these change from country to country, depending on even Warren's effect of interest rate mechanism changes depending on who's holding the debt and how debts are issued, the structure, and on whether even if governments don't issue debt, then you might have a different effect altogether. So you cannot apply one rule for monetary policy to all countries. And even within a country, within, say, the UK or the US, is extremely unpredictable as what's going to happen. My point is, don't use it. The problem is that they don't have anything else at the moment. I mean, you hear some people talk about fiscal policy as a means of, and even on the mainstream, fiscal policy as a factor in inflation and things like that, but they don't really have a reliable means of how to use that as a stabilization mechanism. Only the MMTs have that, or the beginnings of that. They have a theory of fiscal policy and inflation, but what we need is some sort of practical mechanism by which to, either in policy making or something else like buffer stocks and things like that, to apply that to control inflation. And I think the job guarantee is probably the best thing that we have.
Yeah. In terms of understanding the job guarantee as a buffer stock policy, I'm going to recommend an episode that we did with Sam Levy, which I'll link to in the show notes, called Monopoly, Monopsony, and What to Do About Them, because I think he lays that out very well.
Let me just comment a little bit on the situation in the Eurozone. We have a central bank which has just one target, an inflation target, which is supposed to be 2%. So it's very easy to understand what the ECB is trying to do then, because they don't have any full employment targets, no economic growth targets, no sustainability targets. So they just automatically move interest rates up when inflation is getting out of hand. That's their idea of monetary policy. And on their webpage, they also talk about, or they write about, how this is supposed to work. And they say higher interest rates will cause private investment to fall. That means that there will be less workers employed, which means there's less wage pressure when the wages are negotiated. And also there's less demand for goods and services because of investment being lower. So there's less price pressures in the goods market as well. And that's supposed to disinflate the economy. If you look at the German economy currently, it's still doing well. So we have not entered a recession. So last summer, some of the economic experts said that Germany will enter a recession by winter, basically starting in December. And that did not happen. So instead, the economy is still growing okay. And it's forecast to grow even faster next year. So it does not seem that we will have a recession in Germany. But the prices are coming down. Well, the inflation rate is coming down. It's not yet that the prices are coming down, but the inflation rate has fallen quite a lot. And that is, of course, because energy prices have fallen. So if you are the ECB, you cannot say that this is because of high interest rates, because you made the channels explicit. Another channel would be that the higher euro, because if you increase the interest rate, they said then the euro will be more expensive for, the dollar zone or for the pound zone. So that has not happened. So we have had growing employment, and also private investment did not collapse. Real estate has now gone down in terms of prices, so house prices are falling. But that means that these kind of channels that the central bank said that would bring the lower rate of inflation, They have not been activated, but still the inflation rate has come down a bit. So this is very much confirming what MMT has said for decades by now, that the monetary policy and the interest rate, that they play a secondary role. So yes, theoretically, it is possible that a high interest rate leads at some point to lower real estate prices, for example. Because if I think that I could repay a bank loan of, let's say, 250,000 euros over 25 years, and I can borrow at zero interest rates, then of course I could spend 250,000 euros on a flat or a house. But if there's a positive interest rate, I have to spend less because the bank needs to have some of that income that I will be saving in the next 25 years. And I cannot see that somehow my expected income will go up so that I could afford a loan which is more expensive, which has a higher value. So this means that theoretically, yes, high interest rates can shrink private investment. And if there's a collapse in the real estate market, then the fall in private investment can overcompensate the increase in fiscal stimulus by the increase in interest rates. But as you said, it's very complex. You can see it happening, for example, in Sweden, where they have mortgages which have a maturity of more than 100 years, which is crazy. Just figure that out. You have to repay your house or your flat over a whole century. Of course, this kind of mechanism means that people can afford to pay higher prices in Swedish crowns for their flats. And if you have this kind of market mechanism or this kind of market instrument, like mortgages with a maturity of 100 years, then of course everything is much more interest rate sensitive. I mean, if you borrow for 20 years, then an increase in expected interest rates will harm you a little bit. But if you borrow 100 years and you have to refinance, and then those high interest rates translate into higher and higher payments over the years, then this will bite you quite a lot. So I think we have now understood, I mean, everybody also apart from the MMTs, it's not only that inflation is a complex phenomenon, it's also that monetary policy is a complex phenomenon. And you have to say it depends. It's not like every inflation is like the other inflation, and it's not like every interest rate will have the same effects as an interest rate somewhere else, or even over time. So a lot of the economic policy world is much more complicated than the mainstream thought it would be. They had this idea that it's just like, it can be compared, for example, to regulating the room temperature. So you have a window, and if it's too hot, you open the window. If it's too cold, you close the window. That's how you regulate the room temperature. And if you want to regulate the temperature of your economy, you increase interest rates if your economy is running hot. And if your economy is too cold and running too slow, then you put interest rates down. That used to be the idea of monetary policy. But I think by now, it is quite clear that we have to come up with something else because it just doesn't work. Low interest rates did not deliver higher inflation rates in the 2010s. And now it's completely useless to increase interest rates when energy prices are going up and causing higher inflation rates. We will have to rethink monetary policy strategy at a big level, not only MMT, but also central bankers.
So just turning one last time back to Davos, in terms of centre-left critics of Davos, I'm just going to quote The Guardian's Larry Elliott. Quote, "There's nothing quite as nauseating as seeing a bunch of billionaires banging on about doing something about global inequality, but refusing to accept that they need to pay a bit more tax. There is a gap between the Davos analysis and the willingness among most participants to do anything about it." End quote. Now, that's a good and popular talking point, and I'll always support calls to tax the rich, speaking personally. But Patricia, can you just talk about the role of taxes in MMT and why calls to tax the rich might benefit from a bit of added context?
I think Larry Elliott is half right there in the sense that we were talking about Davos being a PR exercise more than anything, any call to actual action, and just seeing how the history of Davos versus what is actually happening, it shows that that's largely ineffective. So I think Larry's talking about that, and he's right to point that out. And I guess he's seen, I think taxing the rich has been this paradigm of action as a means of enabling spending. And I think that's where it falls out a little bit, because if what he means is, oh, we need government to do something about it, but government cannot do something about it until we tax the rich, that's not true. But what we do need to do is address inequality. And what we do need to do is ensure that the rich stop getting so rich, effectively. And if taxes have some role to play in that, great. But taxation is not the thing that's going to allow us to take some action. And I would have much rather him point out to that first statement that you did earlier on about how they were presenting government as fundamentally unable to take action because of lack of resources. And he should have been highlighting that their lack of acceptance that the public purpose has anything to do with climate change.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's also the ecological dimension. I mean, it's those people who are at Davos who are the problem when it comes to resource use. So I think Oxfam published a study showing that the top 10% in terms of income earners, every country is normally, they are a problem in Western countries because they are flying quite a lot. The lower 90%, they fly occasionally, for example. Also, when it comes to living, the super rich have very large houses, which they need to heat, maybe a swimming pool. They have large cars, gas guzzlers, many of them. So when it comes to the ecological perspective, also we need to somehow ensure that the rich do not use up as many resources as they do now. And that's a rich country problem, more or less. So this, of course, something which they also don't want to hear. So they probably think that, well, okay, take some of my wealth and then I have maybe a little bit less money, but I can still sustain my lifestyle, going back and forth, flying to one continent in the morning and to the next continent in the afternoon, and all this kind of global lifestyle. But that kind of global lifestyle is a problem. So we can try to cut it down with taxes. But when, for example, the hedge fund managers in the US in 2020, the most successful ones, the 25 most successful ones, had an average income over a year of more than $1 billion US. So how high does the tax have to be? I mean, you have to have a marginal tax rate of 100%. So this was what Piketty would recommend then, maybe marginal tax rates of 100%. But I think that there's better ways. And this has also been an MMT position that we have to re-regulate the economy so that you cannot have jobs where you have an income of, let's say, $1 billion a year. It's just not just. I like it then when people are hardworking and if they are successful with their business, that's really great. But $1 billion is what you have to pay for if you want to become US president. So for your election campaign, you could finance that if you are a hedge fund manager, one of those successful ones. And just take your income from 1 year and you can finance the whole campaign. That's ridiculous. That's just too much money that you can throw around, especially because the US has no big restrictions on money entering into those kind of campaigns. So these are the two things, the ecological dimension and then also the justice dimension when it comes to democracy and influence. This is where we have to find solutions. And that's, of course, where it's convenient for the Davos people to say, well, we would need higher tax rates, but then nothing is happening. Because if we would get those reforms that I just talked about, then those people would not come to Davos anymore. That would probably be the result.
And just quickly before we move on, the role of taxes in the MMT money story.
Well, we have to be more precise here because there's a difference between tax payments and tax liabilities. So the whole money story in MMT starts with tax liabilities. So the government is able to print money, but nobody would want that. So first we need to make sure that there's a demand for money, that people accept that kind of money. So we impose tax liabilities, maybe starting with value-added tax if you want, but also we have income taxes and other taxes. And also historically we had tariffs, for example, and that's how you make sure that the currency is accepted at all. And then when taxes are paid, then of course you reduce purchasing power in the private sector. And that's a good idea, that when the government is spending money to buy stuff from the private sector, that then the private sector has less money so that it is easier for the public sector to buy the stuff that it wants. Okay, so let's say, for example, the federal government needs 100,000 cars. Then it can tax people in a way that the people buy 100,000 cars less than they otherwise could, so that the government does not have to outbid those people who want to buy those cars too. And that would, of course, then lead to prices moving up. So to some extent, tax revenues are perhaps the most important economic instrument that the government has to stabilize the price level. It's very important. And we have seen, for example, in the aftermath of the French Revolution, when taxes were abolished, it all ended in hyperinflation because the French government still spent some money, but didn't collect any more taxes because that was what the French Revolution was all about. And then the whole thing collapsed, the whole society collapsed because of hyperinflation. And then Napoleon Bonaparte came and so on and so on. So yeah, that's very important to collect those taxes. And then, of course, we have the usual things that you can do with tax rates. You can put incentives on certain things. So you can put a tax on smoking, put a tax on alcohol and so on to provide incentives. You can have negative taxes if you want. And then, of course, you have the whole redistribution of income idea, that you have progressive taxes so that the millionaire has a higher tax to pay than the secretary, which in the US at least does not work, it seems, because Warren Buffett once complained that his secretary pays higher taxes on average than he does. Yeah, but all these things are still there also with MMT.
And for a deeper understanding of these mechanics of modern money, Dirk, the good news for your English-speaking readers is that your highly successful book, MMT Essentials, which we talked about in episode 126, this book is going to get an English translation this year, I think. What's the timeline?
Probably the book will be published in English-speaking countries this summer, and I will have to add some chapters to the book because the publisher Springer has asked me to. So there will be another chapter on inflation, and there will be an additional chapter probably also on the Green New Deal. And I think also one on inequality. So the English version will be larger than the German version. And yeah, I'm looking forward to publish that one.
As somebody that's seen a kind of first draft of a translation, I'm particularly looking forward to seeing what the English language equivalent of a Swabian housewife is. Can you talk about that element of the book for non-Germans?
Yeah, so the Swabian housewife in Germany is a figure of speech of basically a woman from the south of Germany, and she has to manage the household's finances. I'm not sure whether she was invented by Wolfgang Schäuble, the former finance minister of Germany, but it was at least popularized by him. And the main idea is that first you have to have an income and then you can spend money. That's the whole thing. And of course, politicians have always been eager to promote this kind of idea that you have to have sustainable public finance, and then the voters will be happy if the finance minister says stuff like this, that the Swabian housewife, or that the government is just like the Swabian housewife. First, you have to have tax revenues, and then you can spend the money. Of course, MMT has realized that it's the other way around, but nevertheless, this kind of thing is still popular with voters. So this is a thing in Germany, and yeah, I will be looking for metaphors that are used in the US, where, I don't know, Bill Clinton or even Barack Obama tried to show off their responsibility when it comes to fiscal sustainability. I will look into the literature and see whether I can find a good metaphor that replaces the Swabian housewife, because I don't want her to become famous on the world stage.
And in terms of good news, as far as you know, will you be teaching at the Maastricht, Poznan and Bard College summer schools this year?
Yeah, I have been invited to teach at the Poznan Summer School, which I think probably takes place in early September. I just talked to Martin about that. And there will also be a European MMT conference in Berlin this summer. Also, nothing that we have put online yet. We just decided that we were trying to get a program together once more. And I will be also teaching my class at Maastricht University in the summer school, which I think it starts on July 31st. And it's a week of MMT teachings. It's about money creation in the Eurozone. So we go from Treasury to ECB to National Central Bank to banks and then on to households and firms. And then we put it all together to understand something about the macroeconomic implications and why the Eurozone institutions have to be modified for the whole thing to not fall apart.
So lots to be excited about in 2023. We don't have to be bamboozled by the bad economics of Davos. We not only have Dirk's books and the courses we just mentioned and the conference, but looking ahead to the rest of the year, we also have Professor Bill Mitchell's free online introductory MMT course running for its third year, starting on February the 15th. We have the Scotonomics Live Festival in Dundee in March, which Dirk will be appearing at, possibly online.
That's £20 a ticket for 3 days, by the way. Anybody interested in going in Dundee?
That is very reasonable. That's going to be like Davos, but without the war criminals and the rubbish ideas. You could also attend that online. Going a bit deeper, we've got Professor Stephen Hale's Modern Money Lab online postgraduate courses in MMT and sustainability. And of course, we have the Gower Initiative's recently published MMT Key Insights Leading Thinkers book, which we'll continue to talk about in subsequent episodes. And I'll link to where you can find out more about all of the above in the show notes. But most importantly, I'll link to where you can stay current with the work of our fantastic guests today. So with all that said, thank you so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Dr. Dirk Ehnts.
Thank you. Dankeschön.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.